The moment she laughed and called me a mediocre teacher, I realized something strange about humiliation. It doesn't arrive like a slap, loud and sharp, but more like the sudden quiet when every conversation in a room gently stops at once. It was the quiet that told me what had happened. Not the word itself. I had heard worse words in 37 years of teaching ninth graders. But that quiet, the way a dozen forks paused above white plates, the way someone near the window cleared their throat too loudly, the way my brother Frank suddenly became fascinated with the condensation sliding down his glass of iced tea. That quiet told me the room had heard her. And that no one quite knew what to do with it. It was the spring of 2003, and the gathering had been arranged to celebrate my son Daniel's engagement. The restaurant sat on the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the river, one of those places with polished oak floors and soft yellow lighting that made every table feel like its own small island of warmth. White linens covered the long tables they'd pushed together for us, and small vases of pale roses sat between clusters of crystal glasses that caught the light every time someone lifted a drink. There were maybe 30 people there. Our side of the family, her side of the family, and a handful of Daniel's friends from the firm where he worked. Daniel had become a lawyer 3 years earlier. I remember how proud I felt the first time I saw his name printed on the letterhead of that firm in Chicago. Croppett and Myers. He had mailed me a copy, folded neatly inside a card. "Thought you might like this," he'd written. I kept it in the top drawer of my desk for years. That evening in the restaurant, Daniel looked the way successful young men often do when their lives feel like they're just beginning to accelerate, confident in a way that still carried a trace of boyhood underneath. His dark suit fit him perfectly, and every few minutes someone clapped him on the shoulder or leaned over to congratulate him. Across from him sat his fiancée, Caroline. She was bright, articulate, and carried herself with the effortless poise of someone who had grown up in rooms like that one, rooms with polished wood and soft music and waiters who seemed to glide instead of walk. Her parents owned a chain of medical clinics, I had been told. Very successful people. When Daniel first introduced her to me months earlier, she shook my hand with both of hers and said warmly, "Daniel talks about you all the time." At the time, I believed her. Throughout the evening the conversations drifted between tables in the way they do at family gatherings, overlapping waves of stories, small jokes, and the gentle chime of silverware against porcelain. I could smell roasted chicken and fresh bread. Somewhere near the bar a cork popped, followed by a ripple of applause. I remember sitting near the center of the long table, my jacket folded neatly over the back of the chair, my speech notes resting in the inside pocket. Daniel had asked if I might say a few words later in the evening. Nothing formal, he told me over the phone a week earlier. Just, something dad-like. So I had written a few thoughts on a small folded card. Nothing fancy. Just a memory of the first time Daniel rode a bicycle without training wheels. But before any of that happened, before the toasts and the little speeches, there was the moment that changed the air in the room. It happened casually. That's the strange part. Caroline had been telling a story to the table about one of Daniel's colleagues, some young attorney who had apparently bought a lake house before turning 30. There was laughter. Someone asked what the view was like. "Apparently ridiculous," she said, smiling. Then she lifted her wine glass slightly and glanced toward me. "And Daniel always tells them how different his upbringing was," she said lightly. "His dad was a teacher." She laughed softly. "Not even one of those famous professors," she added with a playful shrug. "Just a public school teacher. A pretty mediocre one, if you believe Daniel's stories about his grading." There was another small laugh. Not cruel, exactly. More like the polite laughter people offer when they're unsure whether something is supposed to be funny. And then it faded. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was delicate. Someone shifted in their chair. A spoon clinked gently against the inside of a coffee cup. Across the table, Daniel's smile tightened just slightly. For a moment I wondered whether anyone had actually noticed the word. Mediocre. It floated there for a second, like dust drifting through sunlight. I looked down at the tablecloth in front of me. The linen was perfectly pressed, the weave so fine that it almost looked like smooth paper. For 37 years I had taught history at Roosevelt High School. Room 214. A narrow classroom with tall windows that rattled every winter when the wind came off the lake. I had spent most of my life inside that room. Explaining the Constitution to restless teenagers. Writing dates across chalkboards. Watching generations of students shuffle in and out with backpacks and unfinished homework and the complicated hopes of 16-year-olds who didn't yet know how the world would treat them. I had never thought of the job as mediocre. But I suppose that depends on where you're standing. I lifted my water glass and took a small sip. The ice had melted enough that the drink tasted faintly of metal and lemon. Caroline must have sensed the quiet shift in the room because she added quickly, "I'm joking, of course." Someone chuckled. My sister leaned toward me slightly. "You know how these kids talk," she murmured. I nodded and smiled. Because that's what people do in those moments. They smile. They allow the moment to pass. The conversation moved on soon after. A waiter arrived carrying plates. Someone asked Daniel about a case he had recently worked on. Caroline's father began describing a new clinic opening outside Denver. The room filled again with voices and the gentle rhythm of dinner. But something had changed inside me. Not anger. Not exactly. Just a small rearrangement of understanding. For the first time that evening I realized that Daniel had probably told stories about me over the years. Stories that fit the world he now lived in. Stories about the old house, the used cars, the long summers when I stayed home grading essays at the kitchen table. Stories that might make people laugh politely during office happy hours. It didn't hurt the way people might expect. It simply settled somewhere inside my chest. Later, when the plates had been cleared and coffee cups had appeared beside small plates of cake, someone near the end of the table tapped a fork against a glass. The familiar ringing sound floated gently through the room. "All right," Daniel's friend Mark said with a grin. "Time for a few words." Several people clapped softly. Daniel stood first. He spoke briefly, thanking everyone for coming, talking about how lucky he felt, the sort of warm, practiced remarks young men often make when happiness still feels new. Then he looked toward me. "And my dad wanted to say something too," he said. A few heads turned. I felt the folded card in my jacket pocket as I stood. The room quieted again, though this time the silence felt different, softer, expectant. Someone passed a small microphone down the table. It rested in my hand, warm from the previous speaker. For a moment I simply looked around the room. At the candlelight reflecting off the glasses. At Daniel standing beside Caroline. At the faint nervous smile she wore now. And I thought about the thousands of students who had once sat in room 214. The ones who had rolled their eyes when I assigned essays. The ones who had stayed after class to ask questions they were too embarrassed to ask in front of others. The ones who came back years later to say hello. I hadn't planned to mention any of that. But standing there, holding that microphone while the quiet settled gently across the room again, I realized something important about the word mediocre. And I cleared my throat softly. "Well," I said, glancing toward Daniel with a small smile, "since my teaching career has apparently become part of the evening's entertainment." "Well," I said, glancing toward Daniel with a small smile, "since my teaching career has apparently become part of the evening's entertainment." A few people chuckled, cautiously. Not the easy laughter from earlier in the night, but the careful kind people offer when they're unsure where the next sentence might land. I rested my free hand on the back of the chair in front of me. The microphone hummed softly. "I spent 37 years teaching history," I continued. "Which, if you've never done it, means you repeat the same stories about the Constitution and the Civil War often enough that they begin to feel like family legends. Someone near the end of the table smiled. "Room 214 at Roosevelt High School," I said. "Third floor." Windows that rattled every winter like they were trying to escape the building. There were a few quiet laughs now. I noticed Daniel watching me carefully. He had the expression he used to wear as a boy when he was trying to determine whether he was about to be in trouble. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small folded card. For a moment I looked at it. Then I folded it once more and placed it gently on the table. "I actually wrote a speech for tonight," I said. "But something tells me it might not be the one the evening needs anymore." The room remained still. Not tense. Just attentive. I took a small breath. "When you spend that long teaching," I said slowly, "you get used to the idea that the world doesn't really notice your work." I gestured lightly with the microphone. "No one builds statues for the person who explains the Bill of Rights to 30 sleepy teenagers at 8 in the morning." A few people smiled again. "But that's all right," I continued. "Because the job was never really about being noticed." I glanced down the table where Caroline sat beside Daniel. She had set her wine glass down. Her posture had changed slightly, less relaxed now, more careful. "I used to tell my students something on the first day of every school year," I said. I could almost see the classroom again. The rows of desks. The chalk dust floating in the sunlight. I'd tell them that history is mostly the story of ordinary people doing quiet work that never makes it into textbooks. The microphone picked up the faint sound of someone shifting in their chair. "Farmers who planted crops that fed towns," I continued. "Factory workers who built things they'd never personally use. Teachers who tried to help young people understand the world just a little better than they did the day before." I paused. The room felt very still now. "I suppose from certain angles," I said gently, "that can look like a pretty modest life." I smiled faintly. "But modest doesn't always mean small." A waiter quietly entered the room carrying a tray, then seemed to notice the silence and froze for a moment before slowly backing out again. A few people noticed and exchanged small smiles. I turned slightly toward Daniel. "When Daniel was 14, I said, he decided he wanted to attend a summer program at the University of Chicago." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I don't think I've ever told this story in a room this large," I added with a quiet laugh. A few people leaned forward. "It was a good program," I said. "Very competitive. Very expensive." I could see the memory clearly. The brochure on the kitchen table. Daniel explaining the courses with the excitement only a teenager can have when he begins imagining the shape of his future. "He worked hard on the application," I said. "Wrote 3 drafts of the essay." Daniel's smile had softened now. "He got accepted," I continued. There was a small ripple of approving murmurs from a few guests who hadn't heard that before. "But the tuition," I said, "was about 2 months of my salary at the time." The room grew quiet again. Not the awkward quiet from earlier. A listening quiet. "I didn't tell Daniel that part," I said. I glanced briefly at him. He was 14. 14-year-olds don't need to worry about numbers like that. I rested the microphone closer to my chest. "That spring I started driving a delivery truck on Saturdays for a printing company outside town." I heard someone inhale softly. "It wasn't anything dramatic," I added quickly. "Just loading boxes of brochures and driving them across 3 counties." I shrugged gently. The truck had terrible air conditioning. A few quiet laughs drifted across the table. "I did that for 5 months," I continued. "Every Saturday." I looked at Daniel again. "He went to the program that summer." Daniel's face had gone very still. "He met professors there," I said. "Students who talked about law schools and internships in big cities." I gestured toward him. And somewhere along the way, that 14-year-old boy started imagining a bigger world than the one he'd grown up in. I let the word settle. And that, I said softly, felt like a pretty successful teaching moment to me. No one laughed this time. The room had become very quiet. Not heavy. Just thoughtful. I shifted the microphone slightly in my hand. Now, I added with a small smile, I want to be clear about something. I looked briefly toward Caroline. There is absolutely nothing wrong with ambition. She met my eyes. Her expression was no longer playful. I spent my whole career encouraging young people to chase the biggest futures they could imagine, I said. I turned slightly, including the whole table in my gaze. But sometimes those futures start in places that don't look very impressive from the outside. My voice remained calm. Sometimes they start in small classrooms with rattling windows. I gave a quiet chuckle. And occasionally they start with a mediocre teacher. That line finally broke the tension. Gentle laughter moved around the room. Even Daniel laughed, though his eyes looked suspiciously bright. I lifted my water glass with my free hand. So tonight, I said, I'd simply like to raise a toast. Crystal glasses began to lift around the table. To Daniel and Caroline. I nodded toward them. To the life you're building. A pause. And to the quiet people who helped build it along the way. The glasses touched. Soft, musical clinks. Someone whispered, "Cheers." I handed the microphone back down the table and sat slowly in my chair. For a moment no one spoke. Then the conversations returned, but differently now. Quieter. Warmer. Caroline leaned slightly toward me after a minute. Her voice was low. "I didn't know that story," she said. I smiled gently. "There are a lot of stories teachers never tell," I replied. She nodded slowly. Across the table Daniel was still looking at me. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Just thoughtful. Later that night, as the party began to wind down, he walked with me to the elevator. The hallway outside the dining room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. For a few seconds we stood there without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Dad. I didn't know about the truck. I adjusted my jacket. You weren't supposed to." He exhaled slowly. "I think I've told some stories about home over the years that, maybe weren't very fair." I shrugged lightly. That happens. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. Before the doors closed, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said. Not loudly. Just the way grown sons sometimes speak when they finally recognize something that had always been there. Years have passed since that evening. Daniel and Caroline married the following autumn. They built a good life together. 2 children. A house with wide windows and a big maple tree in the yard. Sometimes, when I visit, my grandson asks me to help him with his history homework. We sit at the kitchen table. He complains about dates the way all students do. And occasionally, when he isn't looking, I glance around the room, at the quiet comfort of the house, the photographs on the wall, the life that unfolded from so many small moments no one applauded at the time. I think back to that restaurant sometimes. To the candlelight and the white linens and the delicate silence that followed a single careless word. Humiliation, I learned that night, is a strange thing. If you carry it with anger, it becomes heavy. But if you set it down gently, sometimes it turns into something else. Something steadier. Because dignity, in the end, doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in the quiet moments when you realize the work you spent your life doing mattered, even if the room didn't understand it right away. And once you know that, the silence of a room no longer feels like judgment. Sometimes it simply feels like people learning how to listen.